I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase.
Outdoor adventure won't wait for engine problems. Things like hard starts, rough performance, and lost fuel economy are often caused by fuel gum and varnish buildup. Seafoam can help your engine run better and last longer. You simply pour a can into your gas tank. Hunters and anglers rely on Seafoam to keep their engines running the way it should the entire season. So pick up a can of Seafoam today at your local auto parts store or visit seafoamworks.com to learn more.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, your home for deer hunting news, stories, and strategies. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kenyon, and this is episode number 106. Today in the show, we're joined by wildlife biologist Jeremy Flinn to discuss all sorts of advice for managing your hunting property, public land hunting, and much more. All right, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by Sitka Gear. And we're back from a week-long break, and today we're joined by Jeremy Flinn, a wildlife biologist, outdoor writer, and all-around whitetail nut. And we're going to be discussing everything from ideas for better managing a deer hunting property to public land hunting advice. So kind of this whole gamut of different ways to hunt. I think it's going to be super interesting, but before we get Jeremy on, Dan, it's been a couple weeks, so I figure we should catch up. Is there anything new in your deer hunting world?
I finally got out and checked one trail camera that I had sitting over a month, and I have at least one shooter from last year who's back.
Nice.
And I can't tell who he is. If it's a buck I call Dork, who is just like this gigantic bodied 3-year-old, or excuse me, he's probably a 6 or 7-year-old this year.
Wow.
And then, or Mark Kenyon.
Ooh. So
they both kind of have split brows. So it's hard to tell at this point. I'm not, I don't study their facial features and their coats. And I set my trail camera up a little too high last time, so I'm not getting their heads when it's down in the mineral station. Mm. So it's kind of hard to get an accurate, so I had to adjust that.
What date did you get those pictures on?
Oh geez. Well, let me pull up. I'm on my computer right now, and that date is the date of the big boy was 5/21.
So May 21st. So how much antler growth did he have at that point?
Well, let's see here. He's got a noticeable split on his main beams. He's got probably 10 to somewhere in between the 8 to 12 range for for main beams. He's got the G2 and that's about it. It's just a bump. So
when you said the split, did you mean the split on the brow tine, you mean?
Yeah, the brow tine, yeah.
Both
one
of them,
brow
or
tine,
just one?
Just one, and it looks like, I don't know, you see some of those brow tines where it grows up the main beam just a little bit, and then you have other brow tines that look like they're coming straight off of the base.
Right.
So this buck has one of each on this picture. So I think if I had to guess, I'd say it's this buck I call Dork. He's just a real tight racked, really massed out, thick, like 300-pound buck.
Jeez, this is reminding me of last year. This is the beginning of my struggling summer while I listen to you talk about trail camera pictures and velvet bucks, and I just have to imagine what might be on my properties. I'm jealous.
Right. So yeah, I got like, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I got 6 trail cameras out on Saturday. I have another one on another farm, and I got 2 or 3 more to put out on another farm yet. So I'm behind the 8 ball as far as getting mineral out and get them coming to the mineral is concerned.
Well, hey, sounds like you have a lot of options eventually.
I know, but that's the good thing, right? So
Yeah, that's exciting. I love these summer months. It's just like this is like that season of anticipation. Like checking the pictures gets you a little more excited every single week, and the antlers grow a little bit more, and you start to slowly figure out, what deer are in the area, who's back, and oh my gosh, I'm stoked. I got a couple cameras out back in Michigan, a couple in Ohio, and now I just have to wait a few months till I get home and check them. But can't wait to see. That's for sure.
I tell you what. So based on the crop rotation, it wasn't last year, but the year before, I had my best year of trail cameras ever. So that would have been 2014 crop rotation. And so we're back in that crop rotation this year. And, there's tons of little young bucks. This bachelor group of like 5 bucks is coming to this mineral site all the time. Nothing giant, maybe 3-year-olds and younger, but that same year, it happened the same way. So the 1st of August is when I started blowing up as far as all these giants. Like, I think I remember talking to you about, had like 6 shooters over 5, even over 5 years old, 5 years old or older. So hopefully they stick around. Logging's done this year, knock on wood. So right. But that's not really important right now. What's important is my extreme jealousy for where you are and what you're doing right now.
Yeah, I guess I'm saying I'm jealous about your pictures, but I can't complain too much, I suppose. Yeah, I just made the drive last week. The reason why we didn't have the podcast last week was because I drove, my wife and I and our dogs headed out for our summer out west again. We're doing it again this year. So we drove through Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, Montana, and then down into Idaho. So we're staying here in Idaho for the next month. And so far, the last 8 days, we've been here 8 days, I think, and I have either hiked or fly fished every single day so far. So I'm trying to keep that streak going as long as I can. I don't know if it'll happen tonight, but I'll try to maybe get out for a little hike because it's been fun. It's been a lot of fun. It's beautiful, beautiful country. So
I just, every time you open your mouth, I want to it's like
just punch me in the face.
Oh, it's not even like, it's like that on the movie what movie, Step Brothers, where he's like, I want to punch you right in your mouth.
I'm sorry.
I don't know what it is about you spreading your good news makes me so jealous. Like, I want to be in the mountains or even just outside, but instead I see made in China signs all day.
Yeah, I know. We were talking earlier about the doldrums of cubicle life. I know that slowly can kill your soul. That definitely did it to me. So I, like I said earlier, if I could, I'd just give you a great big hug right now, Dan. I really would.
I'd accept it too, because I need it.
Oh, man. Well, one of these summers, you've got to pack up the kids and the family and come and visit us out here. Do some hiking, kayaking, fishing.
Gotta teach me how to fly fish.
Yeah. I can't say I'm a good teacher because I am just still learning, but just in the couple, last summer learning and now this summer again, while I'm not good at it, I sure found it addicting. It's like the bow hunting version of fishing, I feel like, for me. It's like, as bow hunting is to regular deer hunting, fly fishing is to regular fishing. It's kind of what I've been finding. It's just, I don't know, another level of intricacy and strategy and like, I don't know, it's difficult, but really, really like engaging and captivating. Like, I just find myself all of a sudden I've been out there 5 hours and I'm like, whoa, where'd the time go? I just feel like I just got here.
Right.
So
right.
Haven't caught a whole lot yet this summer, just a couple, but I'm trying.
Have you gotten your plaid shirt and pipe yet?
No pipe. I'm rocking the plaid shirt on occasion.
Okay.
But I have not found a pipe to my liking yet, Dan, but one of these days I will.
I know it's hard, but just do me a favor and with words paint me a picture of some of the views that, and this is going to satisfy me for maybe 30 or 40 minutes, but just like a couple real quick sentences, maybe one sentence of how beautiful it is out there, and it will make me more jealous.
Yeah, so I'll describe to you this setting. The other day I was fishing the Snake River, which is this beautiful river that runs along the base of the Grand Tetons. So you just have this wide, maybe 100-yard wide river that's just flowing nice, kind of bubbling brook type sounds. You hear the water going over the rocks. You've got a moose standing on the opposite shore looking around, and then as you gaze up, you've got the sun setting behind these three peaks, the cathedral peaks of the Teton Range there, just jagged. It's the most like dramatic skyline of mountains I've ever seen, and it's just like a sawtooth blades up and down across the sky with those beams of sun that are just starting to hide behind it, coming over so much. I don't know if you've ever seen that when you can actually see the rays of light coming over something, whether it be trees or in this case mountains. Those rays of light are actually coming down, reaching down right down to the river in front of me, and that right there is a pretty good day.
That didn't make me feel better.
I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Get yourself a plane ticket.
I know. I'm trying to talk my wife and kids into moving into one of those teeny houses.
Mm-hmm.
Where
you ever seen that documentary, Tiny House?
Oh, yeah. There's a whole TV show on it now.
Oh, I love it.
It's badass.
Yeah, I've been trying to do the same thing, trying to convince my wife we could do it. Because, I mean, I always say if you downsize your payments, you can upsize your life. That's like my new philosophy, is like trying to cut other costs on things that we don't really need so that we can go do the stuff we want to do. So that's one of those things like, gosh, if you could cut your house payment down, you can travel more, do different things, work less. I don't know. It's kind of a fun idea to think about, at least. So we have got to get our guest on the line now, but I believe you've got to run because you're on baby duty today, right?
Right. I'm on a different schedule as far as today because we're recording a different time. But I got in for the intro just to catch up with you, and I guess I'll be back next week at our regularly scheduled programming time.
Yes. Well, I appreciate you hopping on for a little bit, Dan, and we're going to take a quick break for a word from our partners at Sitka Gear, and then we will get our guest on the line. So, as we do every week, we've got a Sitka story for you, and today it's from Mike Mansell, who last year focused an enormous amount of effort trying to get a shot at a buck he'd been after for several years prior. In 2015, he manipulated his property and food plots and tree stands, all with the goal of getting a shot at this dandy 4.5-year-old 9-pointer. And then, finally, one day in December, it all came together, and the buck appeared in shooting range. The only problem? Mike had already filled his tag on another deer, so he couldn't shoot.
I mean, it was upsetting at first, but it was probably one of the most rewarding feelings because all the work that we put in to harvest that particular deer, and just seeing that it would have worked, given if I had a tag at the time. It was pretty special. It was pretty cool to see it where it actually would have panned out.
So, how do you feel this coming year? How excited are you to get another shot at him?
I'm pretty stoked. I think we got a really good chance at him.
So, be honest with me. How many times have you thought about that deer already this year? I've looked at the pictures, the trail camera photos, the video of the encounter several times. He's already on my mind, and I'm pretty sure I'm not going to sleep much this fall. For good reason. Hopefully we'll have a part 2 to this Sitka story as Mike takes another crack at his buck in 2016. But back to that 2015 encounter. On that hunt, Mike was wearing a Sitka Gear Shacket, Fanatic hoodie, and the Equinox pants. If you'd like to learn more about what Sitka Gear options might be right for you, visit sitkagear.com. And now, let's get back to the show and give our guest, Jeremy Flinn, a call. All right, with us now on the line is Jeremy Flinn. Welcome to the show, Jeremy.
Appreciate it, Mark.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot of things from you over the past few years and have thought to myself over and over again, I've got to talk to Jeremy someday. Got to have him on the show. So I'm really glad this is finally happening. Thanks for making this happen, Jeremy.
I appreciate it, man. Like I said, I've been a big fan of the podcast, listened to a lot of them over the years, and kind of as we were discussing, any day is a good day to talk deer.
Yeah, I haven't found a day yet that's not a good one to talk about this topic. So I guess with that said, though, before we get too far, for those that aren't familiar with who you are, can you give us a little bit of background as to, how you got to where you are now and what you're doing today in relation to deer?
Sure, absolutely. So, I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, which coincidentally is where I'm at right now. It's kind of been a full circle ride for me. Did my undergrad at Penn State University in wildlife, worked, numerous jobs and internships doing whitetail deer research, and kind of always knew I needed to go to the next level. And so in 2007, I started doing my master's degree at Mississippi State University. Spent 3 years in Mississippi doing research on trail cameras and aging and scoring deer from photographs was kind of my big background there. And, some people that may be listening to the podcast in 2010, 11, and 12 might remember BuckScore, which was a computer software that was out for a while. And that was one of the derivatives of my research when I was at Mississippi State. And so kind of leaving Mississippi State, I spent several years managing that program and that company, only to end up at Cabela's about 3 years ago, and ran the Midwest and Northeast sections for their wildlife and land management division. And kind of going through on that, Cabela's was a great opportunity for me to expand my horizons as a deer biologist, and but really found my passion to be working kind of on my own as not only a wildlife consultant, but got into growing businesses when I was in my software days, and now kind of my main focus is running my company and being the marketing officer for Stone Road Media. And we do a lot of marketing for hunting organizations, both television shows as well as manufacturing companies. And then we also operate the Buck Advisors, which is basically our wildlife management arm, which we produce a lot of video content for these companies, but also providing good informational and educational pieces for just kind of the average deer hunter. Maybe the guys who own big properties, but a lot of times it's guys who have small properties or even hunting public land.
So you've got such a cool set of experiences. There's so many different things that sound like super interesting to be involved in. But I want to go all the way back to school. What was it like going to school for deer related stuff? I mean, that sounds like a dream come true for most people.
And it was, man. I mean, I remember growing up, and it was kind of funny. I felt like I was in that position where that's the only thing that I really wanted to do. And, for a lot of people thinking about it, you kind of wonder, what do you do with that kind of an education? And really, there's probably a lot of people maybe listening to this and even in school that are asking themselves that same question. I mean, what do you do with that career? And the hard facts are is that there aren't a ton of opportunities once you get out of school. So you've got to make sure that while you're in it, to maximize it more than just the educational level. And what I mean by that is experience is everything. And so it was such a cool opportunity to get involved and be in wildlife, but then it was almost scary to know that there's so much competition for so few jobs, and call me stubborn, and a lot of people did when I was in school. But I just wanted to work with deer. I love turkey hunting, I love grouse hunting, I love trout fishing. At the end of the day, I just wanted to work with deer. And you think about on a landscape level, even across the country, there's not a ton of jobs that work with deer. You got a handful of state biologists that maybe work with deer. On a federal level, very few, if any, because it's such a state-managed species. And then on the private sector, few and far between, especially outside of Texas and most of the major ranches. So it was a cool experience, but it also was scary to think about where is it going to lead to once school was over. And yeah, I had some really good guidance, I think, that pointed to, if you really want to make an impact and try to go somewhere, a master's was what I needed to do, and really to leave my home state of Pennsylvania. That was the first time I really had to go outside of that state and be gone for an extended period of time. That was probably the hardest part of it.
Yeah, I can imagine. So once you did go to get your master's at Mississippi State, I think you'd said you were researching and working on this project related to aging and scoring bucks, right? What were the major takeaways that you came out of that experience with? What did you learn about aging and scoring bucks? Was there any major take-home message?
Yeah, the cool thing about it, I mean, everything dealt around photography. And I mean, even though we did some handheld, photographs, 90% of what we studied were trail camera pictures. And to this day, I'm still a trail camera junkie, just like you. I mean, it's one of those things that it's like Christmas, every day that you want to check trail cameras, you never know what you're going to have on them. We were just looking at some pictures here on a new property I have in Pennsylvania with red fox all over the place. And, even though it's not deer, it's just really cool to see that kind of stuff. So I think that it's in the grand scheme of things to know that you're looking at a picture and you're trying to identify age or antler size. The major takeaways that we found, we studied mostly southeastern deer, but then we really started expanding it, across the Northeast and Midwest, was that although deer, like in Saskatchewan, may be bigger than deer in some parts of the coast of Mississippi or even Florida, we found that they were mostly proportionally larger on an aging standpoint. So even though you look at that fully rutted out buck from Alberta or even Wisconsin, and you're like, man, deer doesn't even have a neck on them, it proportionally is still the same size as a Florida deer would be. So if you took measurements of the neck and compared it to the chest, or took chest measurements and compared it to the stomach girth, as long as you were looking within the same age classes, they were proportionally larger. And I thought that was a big take-home message because, a lot of people have trouble aging deer from different regions of the country because, of nutrition especially. You think, wow, the deer in the Midwest are just, eating crops all year long and they're putting on weight. But really, your eyeballs should be trained to look at different proportions than anything else.
Interesting. So what would you say then? I imagine given all this work you did, you probably came away with some helpful maybe guidelines or steps to trying to age deer on the hoof, whether it be in person or on trail cameras. Would there be anything you could share with us now in regards to how you go about trying to make those, estimates now?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, we looked at so many different variations of different features on the deer compared to each other. Still to the day, probably the chest girth is obviously a big indicator, especially as related to the stomach girth. So, when people think about that classic 3-year-old, like thoroughbred racehorse look, obviously that's because you're looking for that deep chest, but not necessarily filled out in the stomach girth. As it would get closer to a 4-year-old or then even a 5-year-old when we're starting to look at the sag of the stomach. So that definitely was a big indicator. The neck girth, so both at the base and up towards the jawline, actually. So you think about a young 1 or 2-year-old buck that, almost looks as thin as a doe up around the jawline where the neck would meet that area. And you get into that 3, 4, and 5-year-old age class, even in the pre-rut, there's just a definitive difference in that size. So I think that physical feature-wise, those are two of the bigger areas or comparisons that we looked at. And, a lot of people still, and even as a biologist, I say, don't look at the antlers, obviously, for age. But what we did find is one of the most definitive age classifications, especially when you bring in like the chest or the neck into play, as looking at the deer overall, was the basal circumference. As that basal circumference increased, regardless of what was above it, whether it was a 6-point or a 12-point, whether it was a 110-inch buck or a 170-inch buck, that basal circumference played a huge role in us being able to separate age classes. So, we were looking at it on a very micro level. I mean, we were actually using measurement tools to to measure that basal circumference in a picture. But, visually you can tell as well. You can tell the difference between a 2-year-old that's really thin and a 4-year-old that's starting to put some mass on the circumference.
Yeah, so the basal circumference, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're talking just about the mass, the circumference of the antler right at the base, right?
Right at the base, yep. So, obviously you can probably extrapolate that and say, well, thicker mass at the base is going to lead to a better mass measurement overall for a Boone and Crockett score. And then so Boone and Crockett score probably plays a factor in age, and it does. But, really just that basal circumference, when we would look at that measurement individually, and again, bringing in the factors of the neck and the chest girth and the stomach girth, all of those together really was what separated age classes out the best for us on a measurement standpoint.
Yeah, makes sense. It's one of those things, trying to age deer on the hoof or on pictures. It's not a 100%, down pat science, but it sure is a lot of fun trying to figure it out and using these types of guidelines.
It's so tough too. I mean, really, like I tell everyone, when you get to even like this time of the year, deer still look ragged. They're not nearly as thick as they're going to be in another 2 months. That pre-rut time period is about the most consistent you're going to get, because once you get into the peak rut, different deer are going to develop muscular better or worse than other deer in the same age class. So you tend to get the most consistent in that pre-rut. And then when it gets to the post-rut, that's a whole different ballgame. Depending on food source, how worn down from the rut, lots of factors playing into that. But it is more of just training yourself. And like I tell everybody, it's harder for the guys who hunt multiple places across the country. But the ones that are really sticking to a local area or even a single property, train yourself on those deer and really just try to stay consistent. It's like doing a camera survey. You may not know the definitive number of deer every year on that property, but as long as you're monitoring the trend. So if you stay consistent saying these are all 3-year-olds, then these are all 4-year-olds in your eye, and that's what you're going to be fairly close within a year or so. So that in itself is going to help you develop a better herd overall. If you try to always say, well, I'm not going to shoot, 3-year-olds this year, I'm only going to shoot 4-year-olds, and you're very rarely going to be 100% accurate. There's going to be 3-year-olds that look like 4-year-olds. There's going to be 4-year-olds that look like 3-year-olds. It's just the name of the game.
Yeah, definitely. So speaking of that type of situation, hunting a specific property, managing it for a certain age class. I think I saw that you just recently bought a piece of property. Is that right? You just started your own farm?
I did. I've got, after being I lived in the Midwest for the last 5 years. I moved back to my home state about an hour south of where I grew up. And we've got just a small piece, just under 30 acres right at the base of the mountain. So for sure, not the Midwest fertile soils that we were dealing with in Missouri, but, definitely a cool piece to start from scratch essentially and really build up into, more of a hunting property and a wildlife viewing property for my wife and my kids. My wife loves to hunt. I can't wait to get my kids out in the woods and start hunting. It's a cool opportunity to start something from scratch, but also as anyone who has property knows that regardless of size, it's always work.
Yeah. But like you said, a lot of fun to be able to do that work on your own little piece of paradise, right?
It's a dream come true, man. I can't imagine how long it's been that I've thought about having my own piece of dirt that, I could call my own. I could put my own food plot in. I could shoot my own deer over, and I know obviously everything's public resource at the end of the day when we talk about wildlife, but, you definitely look at things a little different when it's your own property. I've leased tons of property in the past. It's a completely different feeling to know that you're responsible for that piece of dirt. You definitely become protective of it. I can tell you that. I probably have more trail cameras up for trespassers than I do have for wildlife. So, but it is a neat thing to have and to experience, especially with the kids growing up.
Yeah. So when you've got a piece of property like this, when you're just starting out and you go into this, it sounds like you went into this with the goal of creating a deer hunting property, a better deer hunting property than it is today. How do you start that process? Like, what are the things you're thinking about or taking inventory of, or where does that process begin?
So, the first thing that I do is I go to maps right away, before I even step foot on a piece of ground. And a couple of things I'm looking for. One, aerial views. I'm looking to see the lay of the land. In particular, what's surrounding the property. So, like I said, I've got just under 30 acres, which most people are thinking, wow, that's barely anything to hunt. The way that it lays out is it's 30 acres of all timber, basically besides where my house is at, which is probably a little over an acre and a half of open ground. Everything else is solid woods. It's a very rugged terrain, lots of deep cuts in the hillsides, steep through the middle. So, I mean, if you look at it over top and you think, wow, that's 30 acres, if you legged it, it may hunt 60 or 90 acres, just because of how much topography is actually there. So that's one thing that I always like to look at, is that overall. But even more so than that, is what's surrounding my property. If it's a 30-acre island in the middle of a residential community or something, then it's one thing. The opportunity to have that kind of stuff nearby and just see what the deer movement would be relative to the properties around you makes a big difference. For instance, my property, I border about 200,000 acres of privately owned timberland from a paper company. And then there's a public state game lands that even borders that. So, if you wanted to say how contiguous is your property, it's probably approaching 500,000 acres. So you never know what's going to end up in the property, even though it's only 30, because of what's surrounding you. So I would say number one is I go to the maps. That's going to give you the best view of not only what your property has and its benefits, its advantages and disadvantages, but what's the potential around it, because that's obviously going to affect it, especially smaller landowners.
Yeah. So when you look at your property right now and you think about that question, you look at the high level view and you say, what does my property have? What does it not have? What are the advantages and disadvantages? What was the answer to that question when you answered it after looking at this?
So obviously the big one was that I had a ton of privately held land that bumped right up next to my property. And then even the public land next to that, knowing that there probably would be some pressure on top of the mountain, and I'm at the base. So naturally we see a lot of wildlife kind of migrate down off the hills as the season progresses, not only from hunting pressure, but weather as well. So that was one big thing that I saw. The one that I really thought was a big advantage to mine, and to some people it wouldn't be, is the property was logged out in the early 2000s, taking everything basically 8 inches in diameter and under. And today it's thick. It's navigable. You can get through it. There's still some big timber. We've got some big oaks on the property and American beech that'll produce some good hard mass. But the amount of greenbrier and cover compared to the mature timberland that basically surrounds it, I saw was a huge advantage. Not only is embedding, but I've told everybody from the start, if I can see deer in this time of the year where there's food everywhere, when we get to the fall and it's all relying on hard mass, and then even into the winter when we're talking about all natural browse, this property is going to just be loaded with deer. And we've seen that. We've seen a lot of deer on the property, bachelor groups moving through already in this late spring when home ranges are pretty small. But I think as we get into the fall and the hard mass, and then they rely more on the natural browse, with these big closed canopy forests basically surrounding it, these deer are going to be just sucked into this property because there's so much natural browse for them, which is always a huge benefit to me. I mean, that's no matter where you're at. I don't care if you're in the Midwest or you're in the Northeast. Number one food source for the deer is going to be the natural browse.
Yeah. So were there any major gaps that you saw or major issues that you saw when you're starting to look at it? Is there anything that you're like, okay, this I need to fix?
Well, I mean, the number one in my lovely home state of Pennsylvania is always trespassing. I mean, we've got such a high number of hunters in the state, high density. There's quite a few houses that border my property, and I'm sure, based on the previous landowners not being hunters, that there'll be quite a few people dabbling in on my property this year. And I expect that. The first couple of years, it's just going to be a lot of monitoring and laying down the law. Knowing that somebody is actually there to enforce trespassing on the property. That's something that every landowner deals with. So the one thing that I thought was going to be the hardest, and still is to this day, and I'll be honest, I haven't even quite figured it out myself, is access. When you've got 29 acres of solid timber, and basically there's two main access points, one where my house is and one that has a little piece of road frontage completely on the opposite end. It's hard to navigate through there. There are some old logging roads, but because it's so thick, at any given point, you could essentially come through a bedding area. So I think the big challenge, even through the first few seasons, is going to be figuring out where are the definitive bedding areas, or do I need to create more definitive bedding areas? Not necessarily because there's a lack of bedding on the property, but more so that I can kind of pattern deer to be able to navigate to my tree stand in and out more efficiently.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. If you can't naturally figure out where those opportunity areas are to get in there unnoticed, you can encourage deer to go certain places where you can avoid. Mm-hmm. So that's a great idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's one of the hardest things that I think any property owner really deals with, but maybe even has the lack of knowledge on is what's the effect of going in and out. I mean, just by nature, we're going to take the path of least resistance. Whether it's a logging road or ag field, it doesn't matter. And we don't necessarily think thoroughly of where those deer are going to be during the entrance and exit times to those stands. And I think with the heavily timbered ground, especially when it's even though there's a little bit difference in the habitat type, deer literally could be bedding everywhere. And I mean, I've jumped them in 10 different places on that property that it's like, how am I going to congregate these deer in an area that lets me navigate through a little bit more?
Mm-hmm. So how have you tried to go about figuring this property out? You haven't hunted it, right? This is your first spring owning it?
Correct. Yeah, we literally just moved in about 2 months ago, so okay. It's like fresh out the gate for sure.
Yeah. So what have you been doing so far to try to start figuring it out, and what are your plans for the next couple months leading up to the hunting season? Just to, this is your first season. How do you establish that base knowledge?
The maps are really critical on that. The second thing, and I try to do it as carefully as possible, is just straight navigation and legging out the property. It's been really hard to try to figure out how to get in there and get out of there without moving deer. And I know a lot of people are extremely sensitive of putting pressure on the herd. But at this time of the year, I'm always one of those people that I don't want to put a lot of pressure on them, but I also don't think that it hurts to walk through a property. If you bump a deer here or there, at the end of the day, 4 months from now, it's probably not going to make a big difference. As we get closer to the season, July, August, then I'm a little bit more concerned. I don't want to be pushing deer around when I'm a couple months out from the season. I want them to settle in. I want them to feel comfortable. But I do try to get out there and move through the property as much as possible, especially with the terrain that we have. I mean, there's funnels and gaps and saddles all through there, and even locating some of the remnant big oak trees through there to figure out where some of these hard mass hot spots are going to be. I think that's one of the biggest things. Also just being a big trail camera nut, we've got 5 cameras, I think, out right now on 30 acres, and I'm sure it'll probably double by the time hunting season gets here. Again, it's figuring out not only patterns on the deer that are currently existing, but just seeing what's out there. I mean, I'll be honest, in that part of the country, I expected to see maybe some, does moving through at this time of the year, a couple small bucks or something. We had a bachelor group a week ago show up, and one of them was probably just a young 2-year-old. There's one buck I think that could probably be a decent 3, and another one that's probably a good 3-year-old too. He was already way out past the years with a split brow on one side, nice. And that was the last part of May. So, for being what I would consider a pretty solid mountain deer, I mean, there's no ag, there's nothing around. Now my thinking starts to say, well, maybe these deer are able to get some age on them because they've got so much room to roam. So can I increase the habitat and the nutrition to now factor that piece in? And if I can, I mean, sky's the limit. I mean, I could produce 150 or 60-inch deer potentially on that property, which will blow a lot of people's minds around here, but they won't know it until after the harvest.
Right. That's pretty exciting just to be able to have that potential out there, though, I got to believe.
Yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned, possibly improving the nutrition. Typically when you either, in this case, starting your own property or when you're advising someone else who's on a new place, do you usually go into that first year and make habitat improvements just right out the gate, just based on what you see? Or do you like to wait a hunting season, observe, learn, and then the next year, with that knowledge, start making changes?
I try to always look at the low-hanging fruit, Mark. I mean, really, where do I think the most limiting factor is? Habitat is one that I'm more cautious on, just because any changes or significant changes to the natural habitat could take multiple years to recover if it's not the right move. Food plots is a different thing. If I say, hey, here's a wildlife opening, it's not growing anything but some annual, food during the summer or late spring, let's convert this into a fall food plot as well, or a late season food plot. That's something that I'm a little bit, more apt to pull the trigger on right away. The habitat's a different beast. I mean, I look at a lot of different things. I mean, typically you can walk into a piece of property and see a browse line or a closed canopy with no natural food on the ground and know pretty quick what you need to do. But then again, you start going in and cutting down 60, 70-year-old oak trees to open up the canopy, and you don't know how that's going to affect the deer. You don't know how that's going to affect the movement. And it's a significant, mark on the natural habitat. It's not going to be fast to replace those trees if for some reason it was the wrong move. So I think that you definitely have to have a good grasp on what's going on. I do think that probably 90% of the people that I've worked with, and including my own property, the first thing to do would be to increase the natural food as well as maybe something supplemental like food plots. And it's usually adding more food is never a hard thing. It's just, what are you going to do to add the food? Are you going to do a prescribed fire? Are you going to open up the canopy? Are you going to plant a food plot? A lot of that depends on the property, and a lot of that depends on the property owner in terms of what their limited resources are. If they don't have any equipment, we're not going in there and planting a 4-acre clover plot. So it definitely depends on what they have and what the property's availability is to increase that natural food or that supplemental food. But I think on mine, I'll probably be fairly conservative. I'm pretty confident in the native food, so I'll definitely let that go through the year and see where it ends up in the wintertime. My gut is I'm actually probably going to be pulling in a lot of deer and have the potential to really put a negative effect on my natural habitat over time. So I think there's an old log landing that I'm going to look at doing a perennial food plot. Again, I don't have the best soil at all. In fact, most of it's old shell and rock. So I'm going to try to put in something that I can get established and only have to maintain over multiple years. It's definitely not the type of soil that you want to come in and have to disc or till every year, because it's going to get nasty after a couple of years. You're basically going to lose all your topsoil.
So in that type of situation, what are you thinking? Like a perennial clover probably, or something else?
Yep, definitely. That's what I think I'll go in with, the perennial clover. I typically in the first year want to have an annual clover in the mix, just because it's going to grow a little bit faster and establish itself ahead of the perennials. Mm-hmm. And that's more for erosion control, if anything. But definitely keeping ahead of the browse line for the deer. So I'll probably have that, and then, I may let that reseed out a first year or something, but then just maintain it for the next 3 or 4 years as a perennial clover. Every once in a while, depending on what it looks like, I could go in there and, broadcast some kind of brassica or sugar beet or something like that in it if I think that the late season needs some additional forage. But I still think you can't go wrong with a perennial clover as long as you maintain it correctly.
Yeah. So on the food plot topic, given the fact you've worked with a number of people all across the country, it sounds like, wow, if there's any main issue or mistake that you see a lot of people make when it comes to food plots, what would that be?
So first and foremost, and it's always it's a topic that we deal with every day. We're involved with a couple different food plot companies, and one of those is a company called Deer Grow that we started about 3 years ago. But taking soil samples, no matter where you are, I don't care if you're in the river bottoms of Iowa, having that knowledge of what the soil current status is, and really more so what the plants are going to need. I mean, we think about the soil and amending the soil to appeal to the plant, but a lot of times it depends on what plant you're putting in. You know, there's a big difference between putting corn in there, which is going to suck the soil dry of nitrogen, and putting soybeans in, which is going to fix nitrogen. So I think that's probably one of the biggest misses out there, is taking a soil sample, even on a food plot, you know, whether it's brassica, oats, clover. That's a big factor. Along with that, though, and likely what I would say the biggest mistake made is not putting a food plot enclosure or exclosure cage on it to see what the food plot's potential was without deer browsing. You know, I'm sure you've seen it. How many times you walk up to a food plot and somebody says, well, you know, seed failed or weather was bad. And, you know, 9 times out of 10, it was because the deer just mowed it to the ground. And if you had a cage on it, you'd be able to look inside there and see, you know, 6-8 inch beautiful clover, and on the outside, bare dirt because they ate it down to the ground.
Yeah.
I think that's a huge indicator, and it's something that far too often is overlooked by food plotters today.
That's a great point. Now, I think I remember seeing when you were doing some of the work with Cabela's, you were doing some food plot work over on Bill Winke's property. Is that right?
Yep. Well, absolutely. Yep. Did a lot of food plots on Bill's property.
So I'm just kind of curious, from like a fan of Bill Winke's deer hunting success out there, what kind of food plot system did you guys have in place there? What was he doing, and why were you guys doing that?
You know, Bill had a really good food plot. First of all, he did one of my favorites, which is he planted a lot of summer crops and he left them up all year long. And I know for most of the people out there, anybody that harvests a yield and thinks about Iowa and leaving, you know, soybean or corn up for deer probably is just shaking their head. But, you know, it was an amazing thing. I mean, it's probably one of the biggest things that I do. I love planting, especially soybeans. I love planting soybeans in the summer, having that protein available all summer for, you know, growing bucks, but also fawns and does lactating. And then you kind of taper off, you know, as you get into that first part of the season when acorns start falling. And then about, you know, at least in most of my areas that I've dealt with, in around mid-November to late November, through the end of the year and even into early spring, having that ability to have, you know, pods above the snow line, through where food is so scarce, it's an amazing source of nutrition. And that was one thing that Bill did very well, leaving those crops standing in small sections too. It wasn't that he left 60-acre fields available for them. You know, he had smaller sections. Some areas he did harvest. And then he had a very good balance of fall annuals. Typically we would plant a lot of brassicas, you know, a lot of turnips in the ground. And then having perennials. He would have perennial clover in certain areas. So his balance was good. What Bill was really smart with was some of the areas that were the most hard to access during hunting even, but really just in general, he would always put in a good perennial. And he knew that he could leave that down there. And even if he didn't get down there to manage it very well, there would always be a good food source year round in those spots. And we saw that in an area he called the Tube, where he killed the double G4 buck a couple years ago. That buck would just hang down in that clover all the time. And it was a space that basically you did not want to have to go into. So to think that he could stay out of there, you know, through the summer, knowing that was his range, you know, maybe look for sheds you know, in the winter for a little bit, but just stay out of that area and know that there'll be nutrition down there to hold him in that area. I thought that was a really smart plan by him. But I love Bill's aggressiveness on the summer plots for literally the entire hunting season. I mean, how many times do you see him hunting over standing beans or corn, probably more than over fall annuals.
Yeah. Yeah, it's awesome to be able to have that type of situation where he's able to do that and have the equipment and have the land and everything. And one of the things I always, I got to believe one of the challenges it's a good problem to have, I guess, but one of the challenges when you have as much land as he might have and the ability to put in as much food, the trick is how do you hunt large food sources or all these different food sources? It's kind of easy when you're on a 40-acre piece and you've got 1/2 acre food plot. Well, that if you hunt that little food plot, there's going to be some, you're going to be within shooting range or something like that. But when you're in a situation like Bill's, it seems like there's a lot more thought that has to go into how you design those food plots or how you know when to hunt which one. Did you see anything while you were working with him that was kind of eye-opening about how he designed these food plots or anything like that?
I think one of Bill's toughest challenges, and something that people probably didn't even realize, I mean, he had a ton of food plots on the property and very strategically placed. But one of the things he did throughout the early years of the farm is he did timber stand improvement through the entire farm. And actually some of the places it was on the second round. He had more natural vegetation and food than almost any other property I've ever seen. And I think it actually made it more difficult to hunt because the deer had so much natural food that they didn't really feel the pressure to have to come out into any of these food sources, whether it was an annual food plot or a summer food plot. And I think that was one of the reasons that he could keep deer or so many mature bucks on his property at a given time was because of the bedding area. I mean, yeah, it was a huge piece of property, but a deer didn't have to move. He had water, he had shelter, he had native food, he had, supplemental food in the food plots. It was such a different type of property than you're used to seeing in that area. So I thought that was one thing that he really had to overcome. And to do that, we saw him get more and more aggressive into these micro plots or these poor man plots. And I think it was a neat thing to show these people who didn't have equipment how you can make a quality food plot. But it was also because we were getting in some of these areas closer to bedding areas that you probably weren't going to get that much equipment into. And you didn't need to make a full acre plot. You only needed a 1/4 acre or less just because you were trying to slow them down, moving from a bedding area or these natural food areas into a destination food plot, which would be one of these larger crop fields.
Yeah. I love the fact that he showed that, like you mentioned, because it does show people that they can, still get a food plot and it still can be effective. You don't need huge food plots to enjoy benefits of a food plot. It might be a different benefit. A 1/4 acre food plot isn't going to make the nutritional difference that that 20 acres of food plots would make, but you still can see benefits.
Absolutely.
But I want to take a step back to something else you said there. You mentioned the fact that in these sections, these deer didn't need to move very far because they had great food, great cover, and water. And water's something that doesn't get discussed a whole lot, I think, because in many situations it's kind of a given. But do you ever find yourself on properties where that is a limiting factor and you do need to supplement it somehow? Or is that something that, people worry about too much, maybe in putting in water holes and stuff is overboard? What do you think about that?
We've done some testing recently. We actually just did a video that we're going to put out here not too long from the Buck Advisors on building a water hole, and we've got some cameras around it. We've dealt with kind of a mix of both. A lot of these areas in the Midwest and Northeast and even the South, you get these seasonal water areas. It could be a really nice creek, but by the time you get into July, August, if you're not getting rain, it's going bone dry. Now, fortunately, so far this summer, it's been wet, almost too wet, early into the summer through a lot of the Midwest and into the Northeast. But I do think that it becomes something of a limiting factor as you get into the later part of the summer and early fall. Now, to go to the extent of putting in a water hole or anything like that, it's hard to say. I mean, a deer could cover 150, 200 acres pretty easily as we get into that later part of the summer if it needs to. That said, it's one of those things that it's kind of like a human. You can go without food for quite a while. Water is a different story. Deer gets most of its water when it's consuming its natural plants. So, as long as the water quality is in the plants, then it's not as big of a factor. But if we get into a drought condition like we've had a couple of years in the last 5, then that starts to be a bigger red flag for me. And having supplemental water, I mean, I've seen Grant do it on his properties with good success. I've had other people kind of, work with these seasonal water sources to create some standing ponds. I'm up in the air on it. And really the big thing for me, Mark, is the fact that when you create these watering holes and stuff, you stand to create mud flats, which can promote the midges that transmit hemorrhagic disease. And obviously everybody's been familiar with that in the last few years. So I've been on a big stance of minimizing mud flats. So, with that, if you can control the mud flats and put in a decent water hole, then I'm all for it. If you think you're going to create more exposed mud flats, if it's a drought year and you're having mud flats exposed, the odds of you having hemorrhagic on your property are probably pretty good. So I surely don't want to create any more breeding grounds than already naturally exist.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I had not thought of that, but I know more and more, especially like you mentioned back in 2012 and even 13 to a degree with the horrible EHD outbreaks we had across most of the country. More and more people are starting to think about, how can I start to, in some way, manage to minimize the impact of EHD if it does hit again. And that seems like a pretty smart thing to think about if that's something you're concerned about. Is there anything else that you can think of or that you've actually thought about when it comes to trying to minimize the potential for EHD other than just minimizing those mud flats?
As much as I love having mineral blocks out, to me, it's more of an attractive thing than a nutritional standpoint. Obviously there's some benefits to the micronutrients in some of these blocks. I mean, at this time of the year, salt is something that's a great thing to be able to supplement when deer are consuming a lot higher water content. But, anytime you congregate these animals into a smaller area, whether it's a feeder or a mineral block or a watering hole, the fact is you kind of increase the opportunity for transmitting diseases. In the case of hemorrhagic, closer density of the deer is going to increase the opportunity for blood mills to be taken by these female midges. So I think that, in times of knowing, and honestly, I wrote an article, I don't know, it's got to be 4 or 5 months ago, and I think it appeared in one of the more recent deer hunting ones, on would this be a hemorrhagic outbreak year? And to this day, I still think that we're teeing ourselves up for a really bad year. It's been a very wet spring. It's continued into the first part of the June. If it heats up and the water shuts off, I don't think it's going to be good for a lot of people across the Midwest and the Northeast.
And so you're saying, and let me see if I understand this, you're saying that would be the case because you've got so much water now that you've created essentially what will be larger mud flats once the drought hits in July or August and all that dries up, leaving this exposed mud, a lack of water, and you've got more deer moving to the areas where those fewer water sources are, and then all these exposed mud flats, which allow a lot of midges. Is that right? 100%.
Right on the head. Yeah. And I mean, that is exactly the conditions that we dealt with in 2012 that led to, a massive outbreak. We had a very wet spring. We formed all these basically seasonal water pools. As we hit the drier summer months, they all evaporated up, leaving these big mud flats behind. The ponds and pools that were left congregated deer around it because we were essentially in drought conditions. And the result was, massive deer die-offs across many states. To this day, harvests are still suffering from those bottlenecks.
Yeah.
So, I fear, I hope I'm wrong. I hope that it stays wet and moist all year, and next thing we know, it's September and we don't have to worry about it because we started hitting frost. But it seems like we're teeing up for something that could not be at a worse time for some of these states that are already suffering from 2012 and 13 outbreaks.
Yeah, geez, I hope that's not the case because, we're just starting to see some of those states now get to be, 4 years out and hopefully starting to get some of those mature bucks back. And if we got hit again, that would be very disappointing, I know, for a lot of people.
Be a hammer for sure.
Yeah. So kind of speaking of deer, the deer herd, I'm kind of curious about how, kind of going back to your situation, either on your new farm or I guess for anyone, when you first start on a property, how do you go about trying to evaluate that herd or take inventory of that herd to figure out, okay, what kind of bucks do I have here? What's the structure? What's the age structure, et cetera, et cetera? What are the things you're looking for, and then how do you go about looking for that stuff?
I would say that probably the number one thing I do is always go to my cameras. I mean, it's great to scout and be out in the woods and, or fields, and I love being out there. But, efficiently wise and manpower wise, it's just not something that's gonna pan out. Cameras are an amazing tool to be out there 24/7 for us. And, so setting cameras up and doing a camera survey, whether it's an official camera survey and you do the analysis and you try to extrapolate data and stuff, that's a whole different ballgame. I mean, really just getting out, even doing what I'm doing. I've got 5 cameras on 30 acres, which if you look at most of the trail camera survey research, it says 1 per 100, 1 per 200. I should be capturing every deer within, a 70-mile square radius. It's trying to get a snapshot of what the herd looks like. And kind of to me, especially this time of the year, if you're getting decent bucks on the camera, and it's not to say, I mean, we're basically right at that end of spring, summer home range piece, things are going to change here as we get into the fall. Home range are going to change, deer are going to disperse. But if you've got some deer on your property at this time, and if you've got some bucks that are starting to look pretty good, there's a really good chance that you'll at least see those deer early into hunting season. And that's the one thing that's excited me about this place is I've seen, several different bucks and a couple bucks that actually could stand to be something this year, especially in a state like Pennsylvania. And, I think that the potential to see those deer early in the hunting season exists. So cameras is probably my easiest way. Plus, I mean, just sitting there and being able to study a photograph, or a video, having a camera on video mode is something that's a huge advantage to us nowadays as hunters. And I do like to go through and do my buck to doe ratio. I like to take on a bigger properties on leases and stuff. I'll look at the actual density and think about how many deer, how many does I need to take out. At least on my 30-acre piece, I'm not too worried about it this year. I am concerned that there's going to be a big suction of deer coming in the wintertime because of the natural browse that this property has versus around it. So then that begs the question of, do I need to harvest more deer on 30 acres because I'm sucking so many in? And if I do, how do I do that without, putting too much pressure on the property to, basically ruin it for multiple seasons to come? So it depends on the situation, but I don't think anybody can go wrong with using cameras, whether you use bait or attractant. That's kind of a personal decision. But using those as your scouting tools, I mean, daily life is pretty busy, and those things do a pretty good job of being able to keep you up to date on what's going on out there.
So do you think that the average guy or girl should be trying to perform more of an analysis from the trail camera? So maybe your average person right now probably just looks at those pictures to see, hey, is there a big buck? And is that big buck around my tree stand? Should we all be actually looking at density and age structure and buck to doe ratio and stuff like that?
I think it depends on your goals. I mean, if you want to be able to, see or have the ability to hunt bigger deer, or even in some places, we just talked about EHC, more deer, then yeah, you need to be critical. I mean, one of the things I remember doing in 2012 and 13 is, most hunters, even in areas that were stricken by EHD, there was, at least in Missouri areas, there were some low acorn crops. So a lot of the deer were very visible in food plots, and people hunted the herd as if nothing happened that late summer, early fall, and they hammered the deer. And so now you had a harvest that was pretty aggressive on top of an EHD, which was probably the worst that the state had ever recorded. And so it makes sense that the next season it was like, where are the deer at? And one thing I always try to tell people, and it doesn't matter if they own 1,000 acres or 10 acres, is just because, it's legal to shoot 4, 5, 6, 7 does doesn't mean that it's appropriate for your property. Every property is different in its own right. So yeah, the state may say, hey, you can shoot 5 does on your property if you want. But if you're not seeing does on the property. They don't exist on the property. Then why would you go out there and harvest 5 just because the state said it was legal to? It's a case-by-case basis. That really is a big play on that. So I don't know if necessarily everyone needs to. I mean, the family that loves to hunt, they, want to have some meat for the freezer. The kids, it's an experience. I don't think they need to be out there analyzing it. I think it's a great educational tool. I'm all for having older age structured bucks. But at the same time, when it's time for my child to hunt, if he wants to shoot the first one-horn spike that comes through, let him do it. So, it's different for different people. But if anyone is thinking about managing the herd, then absolutely. You should at least take it in more consideration than a passerby of, I'm only scrolling through the next 5,000 pictures looking for big antlers.
Yeah.
There's a lot more to it that you can see and learn in the pictures that not only will make you a better deer manager, but I think will make you a better hunter at the end of the day.
Yeah. So you talked about figuring out how many does to kill, and this is a question I think a lot of people have. Mm-hmm. Is there any relatively easy, consistent way for someone to determine the right number of does to kill on their property? Or do they need to do a really in-depth trail camera inventory, figure all that kind of stuff out?
I mean, to be accurate, yeah, they probably need to do a survey. My biggest kind of factor I look at is if I think about in the times that deer have the least amount of food available. So as we get into that, early midwinter period and especially into the early spring, you're at about the bottom of the barrel in terms of food. And I'll walk around on the property and I start seeing heavy browse lines, no native foods, but lots of sign. I don't even have to know what your deer density is or your buck to doe ratio is to tell you need to kill more deer. You need to kill more does. And it could be seasonal. You could look at me like I'm crazy because in the early part of hunting season, you didn't see a deer on the property. But what I always try to emphasize with people is you have to manage your herd numbers to match the lowest amount of food and space during the year, which is typically the early spring. So it doesn't matter if, you have hardly any deer early in the season as you get into mid-season. If at the last part of the season into early winter or early spring, you have a massive amount of deer, you need to be managing your herd the rest of the year for that number to keep that number down as close as possible, because that's when you're going to cause the most damage to your property. And that's when your deer are going to suffer the most. I mean, your bucks are going to come out of the winter and early spring in horrible condition. They're going to have to put 4 months of resources to repairing the body before they can even think about putting extra nutrition to the antlers.
Right. Do you think that there are any negative impacts of having too many does on a property, not just from a nutrition standpoint, but on like a space standpoint? If you're trying to target older bucks or bigger bucks, have you ever found a property that is just so overwhelmed with so many does that you end up having fewer bucks wanting to hang out just because there's not space? Is that a thing?
I don't know if I think it could be. A property I grew up about an hour from where I live right now. In the summertime, if I take you out there in, late July, early August, we'd sit at a telephone pole and watch 50 acres of soybeans. And you would see more bucks, more mature bucks, and probably bucks that you'd never think you're sitting in the state of Pennsylvania. It would pan out that you would think it would be the greatest rut hunting spot ever. And when the rut came, it was the worst hunting ever. And it was because there were so many does on the property that I think that the bucks did not have to work to find a doe. Now, we saw them spread out really fast as the season came in. Soybeans turned, then they were harvested, and bucks seemed to kind of, vanish out besides the stray that would come through maybe on a hot doe. But like I said, they didn't have to move. They didn't have to work to find does. And I think that was probably the most limiting factor. I mean, I grew up hunting a property that was almost non-rut existent. So I remember the first time I was in a stand in Missouri during the rut. And, it was like, things are starting to heat up. And then I'd see a buck chasing a doe. And I'm like, man, this is the rut. Because to me, that was the first time I really experienced what people would talk about when they saw the rut. And then it was like the next morning I had like 9 bucks come through chasing does. And it was like, okay, this is what the rut is.
Yeah.
And so it was amazing for people to understand, like when I said, I don't even want to think about that property during the rut. And they're like, why? There's 15 bucks in a field at night. Well, there was 52 does as well. So, I think that's probably the biggest thing. But I do think that there's a space factor. I mean, you think about those old mature bucks outside of the rut, they're solitude animals. You don't see them very often with another buck or doe unless it's, getting into that early coming out of a bachelor group or as we're transitioning into the rut phase. So I do think that there's a space factor in it. But I also look at some of the research that starts to show that some of these older bucks into the 5, 6, 7-year-old age class don't even move that much anymore. They're not doing the 1,000 to 2,000 acre home ranges that a 2, 3, or 4-year-old buck may be hitting.
Right.
So I think that there's multiple cases to say, yeah, it definitely affects it. To me, I would rather have a tighter buck to doe ratio than, having all these adequate does available for the rut, because I don't think that rattling works as good. I don't think that scents work as good. I don't think that grunt calls work as good. I think that hunting during the rut is harder, and that's firsthand experience from a property I hunted for 15 years that should have been theoretically a rut hotspot to kill a big buck every year.
Yeah, definitely. Increased competition for does always seems to lead to better activity from a hunting standpoint.
Absolutely. I mean, the best days in the woods I've had is when 1 or 2 does have gone into estrus and there's 5 to 7 bucks fighting for them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that to me is when they say they've seen rutting activity, that's what they're experiencing. And anybody that hunts the rut knows that when most of the does are in estrus, we hit that peak estrus cycle. It's about as lull as it gets in the woods because the bucks are basically doed up. It's no different than, a gobbler getting henned up in the spring. So you get that kind of lull. It's when those first few are coming in, or even towards the tail end of the rut, when there's the last few coming in, that's about when you start hearing people saying, yeah, I've been seeing bucks chasing.
Yeah. Speaking of the rut, I actually wanted to bring this up later, but I'll touch on it now since we kind of segue nicely to it. I've read some stuff from you in regards to the rut, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe when it comes to the rut in most of the country, especially the northern part of the country, you're in agreement with most people when it comes to the fact that it's relatively consistent due to photo period, et cetera, et cetera. I guess number one, is that true with your belief?
Yep.
Okay.
If you're leaning towards the lunar phase, then yes, I'm a much more strong proponent of photo period guiding. Yes.
Okay. So then what my real question then was, okay, if that's the case in the north, I know it's different in the south, and I think I've seen you write something about that in the past. Could you walk us through why the southern rut is different and what people in the south should be thinking about when it comes to trying to figure out when's the rut, how to hunt it?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a completely different ball game. I mean, I laugh about it, I guess, when I hear people talk about, well, like, what 5 days do you want to take off during the rut? Because when I grew up in the Northeast and living in the Midwest, there were 4, 5, 6 days that, if you took those off, you were going to experience some pretty crazy rut action. When I lived in Mississippi, and the guy started saying, well, the rut will be good, but you'll kind of get the drip rut. And I was like, what are you talking about? And it was the fact that, one day it could be hot and heavy, then it might be a week before you see any other action. And then you might see a little bit this day and nothing the next. And then the third day, it's just on fire. And so you basically see this widespread swath of rutting activity across a lot of the Deep South, and in particular, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, even some parts of Georgia. And you see this kind of stretched out rut. And so a couple of things that I at least with my research and working with a lot of the professors I did, that we came up with some theories. Number one is probably what I think is the most proficient is the fact that the buck to doe ratio is throwing off some of the rutting activity. So in some of these areas where the buck to doe ratio is so skewed that there's actually bucks missing does in estrus. When they basically stay in estrus for 72 to 96 hours, they're getting missed because a buck is actually occupied with another doe that's in estrus tending to her. So then it has to wait 28 days before that cycle starts again. So you start to see where these periods, if you stagger them out, that, you know, every so many days there may be a new group of does coming in because these bucks are basically occupied. And also a lot of the reasons that in February, March, you see southern bucks that look like they've just been run through the ringer, because they're instead of a 2-week rut craze period, they're going a 2-month rut craze period. So that's one of the big factors. The other thing that we see is you don't have as definitive of growing harsh seasons in terms of weather and vegetation. So as we think about the North and the Midwest, you know, there's very definitive times of the year. I mean, obviously a doe doesn't want to have a fawn early, where there still could be the potential of less vegetation and, you know, an early April potentially, as well as the fact that the later we go into the season, the less nutritious the vegetation is, less cover. Very definitive in that piece. As we think about the South, you know, we start getting spring green up in early March, and as the season progresses, we don't have those definitive frosts and things coming in the September, even early October period. I mean, heck, in some of those places in October, it's still 90 degrees. So even though the food quality may not be as good, they're not as concerned with having the vegetation being killed off by frost and freezes. You know, so we would see fawns that would be born, you know, in typical late May, early June time period, but I'd also see fawns being born in September and October. Wow. And so it's hard to place on which one it would be. You know, is it because they have a more broad area that they can cover in terms of the growth and the seasonality? Or is it just because the buck to doe ratio is so out of whack that there are does being bred in February, March, April, instead of being all bred in that November, December time period? So, you know, those were the ones that we looked at. The big question always remains out there, and genetics is kind of the dirty word in deer management. You know, nobody wants to say that genetics are different. And in this case, it's not as much different as it is different from the origins of where these deer were coming from. So, you know, what we tend to see, coincidentally, we see different body sizes in a lot of these areas, especially in Mississippi, but we would see groups of deer within a 40 or 50 mile area having significantly different peak breeding dates. And I'm not talking about like a couple of days, I'm talking like a month plus different.
Wow.
And so it begs the question of how can a deer group that's 50 miles apart have a peak breeding that's a month or a month and a half? And so you start to think about the restocking efforts of the 1900s, deer coming from Mississippi, some coming from Mexico. There's a large group of deer that were brought from Wisconsin that had assumably died from probably a hemorrhagic or something that they couldn't be adapted to. You know, is there some lingering effect or imprint on these deer? And, you know, we saw that from our research in Mississippi. We would bring deer from different parts of the state and put them all in a captive research unit. And we would see deer that were from the lower coastal plain of Mississippi that typically had their fawns late in the year, like July, August into September. When we moved them 2 hours or 3 hours north, they still had them in July, August, September, even though they were bred in that new area. Those deer from that area would typically, you know, have fawns in June and July. They would still have fawns in June and July. So it was kind of weird to see that, you know, somehow there was an imprint on these deer to have this timing of fawning. And so, you know, there's a lot of potential factors that could come in there, but it definitely seemed like there was something more environmentally affecting them. But it also could be a genetic thing too.
Fascinating stuff, although it sounds like maybe terribly frustrating for hunters in that area trying to figure it out for themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, I still go to the fact of kind of whether you're in the Northeast or you're in the Deep South, if you've hunted long enough, you can pretty much lay a thumb down on that, rutting activity is going to occur around the same time every year. I know Bill is huge on saying how I think November 7th is his favorite day. Like, hey, if you hunt November 7th, it's going to be nail on the head. And I've had the similar experiences. November 5th to the 7th in Missouri and Kansas, I've had great experience. But I think, what determined that is not necessarily the photo period or the moon phase or genetics. It's just the fact that, every year on a fairly consistent basis, those deer are going to be breeding at that same time. That's their optimal time to breed, knowing that approximately 200 days later is their optimal time to have the fawn. And in the South it is. It's a lot less predictable. But some guys like that too, because then it's like, hey, instead of 2 weeks and I miss the rut, I've got 2 months to potentially catch this thing. If the last day of the season, I could still be catching rutting activity. I don't know if I necessarily think that's great for the bucks that are, spending all that energy over 2 months, or even the fawns that are potentially being born in August, September instead of June and July. That's a huge disadvantage in their first year.
Right.
But hey, it is what it is.
Totally, well, not off topic, I guess, but kind of digressing from where I wanted to go, but you just mentioned the fact that, okay, so in some of these areas down south, you've got fawns being born over the course of several months, spread out. Is that a disadvantage for deer, for fawn recruitment in the southern part of the United States compared to the north?
100%.
Because I think the reason why that might be my hypothesis was that in the north, when you have fawns all dropping at a relatively consistent short time span, you have this overload of fawns, so they cannot be predated as much. So the coyotes have so many fawns, they can't kill them all, while, in the south, if you're spread out, there's more prey spread out over a longer period of time, and it allows predators to have a larger impact. Is that right?
Exactly. Yep. Exactly it. Yeah. And I think that's always been a case in the South is, like you said, there's only so many that the predators can consume in the North in a tight time period. And we always emphasize that with people that have fawn recruitment issues. It's like, hey, listen, you may not be able to change the genetics or the environmental effects these deer are having, but you can tighten up your buck to doe ratio to try to ensure that breeding occurs in a tighter time cycle. Therefore, the fawning occurs in a tighter time cycle. I think as these things are stretched out, especially as you get into the mid to later parts of July into August, you got a couple fawns dropped every day. That coyote or that bobcat is eating every couple of days. So I definitely think that's a huge impact and probably a big advantage, besides cover effects that the North has over and the Midwest has over the South.
Interesting. Yeah. As you said that, it just kind of sprung out to me that, wow, that makes a lot of sense as to some of the fawn recruitment issues that you see.
Sure. Yeah.
Interesting.
South of 30% down there typically, and a lot of that depends on timing and when you're looking at it. But I would say pretty consistently in a lot of those areas that aren't managing for predation, you're south of 30% in your fawn recruitment rates, and
wow.
Most of the time in the Midwest and then the Northeast, you're probably north of 50%.
Right.
So it's a significant difference for sure. And even if you manage for the best habitat, yes, it increases cover. It still plays a big piece of the game in terms of the fawn recruitment and how heavy the predation is. But yeah, the longer the rut is, the longer the fawning season, the more increase in predation that you're likely to see on the property.
Yeah. Very interesting. I kind of want to pivot now to actual hunting tactics. We've talked a lot about, improving a property, understanding a property, how to manipulate a property, maybe how to understand what type of herd you have on the property. But I want to talk about actually killing and harvesting these deer on that property, because of course that's our end goal in many cases.
The culmination.
Exactly. So I want to talk about two different situations though, that I think you've got experience in both, which is why I want to touch on both. One would be hunting, a piece of private land, maybe a small piece of private land like what you now have. And then number two, I want to talk about public land hunting and maybe compare and contrast the two. So I guess first, when it comes to hunting your own private piece, for anyone who owns their own piece, they've been doing some habitat work, maybe they're trying to manage it for better deer. What are some of the things that you've found based on your own experiences or other people you've worked with that, either what are some of the biggest mistakes you're seeing these people make, or what are some of the things you've seen other guys or yourself do to help maximize your hunting success in that type of scenario?
I think probably the biggest mistakes that I see is over hunting. And that could be on a property level, but likely on a stand level. Anybody that hunts long enough, or even hunts a specific deer long enough, you tend to have that hot spot, that hot stand, that hot area. And I think we all get wrapped up in the pursuit and often don't think about, even if we are using scent elimination clothing and devices and trying to get in and out as quickly as we can and as quietly as we can. The fact is that you've got some pressure in that area. And, for me, it's always been those first couple sits in a new spot where I feel like I have the most success. So, hunting and over hunting a stand or a property is probably the number one killer of big bucks to me, not necessarily by the gun or by the bow, but just the fact you're going to boot them off your property and you're never going to see those deer again. So I think that's probably something that a lot of hunters need to really focus on is strategically, how are you going to hunt this? It's one of those things that we only have so much time. I mean, life is busy, but you've got to be patient. That's the key. Anytime you rush something, especially hunting a mature buck, odds are not going to be in your favor to actually, finish the job. So I think that's something that a lot of people need to work on. On a success standpoint, what's really kind of impressed me, whether they're, a seasonal based hunter, and just out on the weekends or when they can, or if they're more serious, is the fact that I see more and more people taking pride in the deer that they don't harvest than the ones that they do. I feel like, for me, one of my greatest passions growing up was going to deer camp, in that tradition. And it didn't matter. Everybody, of course, wanted to shoot a buck. But at the end of the day, it was just being there and experiencing the tradition and the memories you make. And I see more and more people doing that in a little bit different manner. It used to be that you go up and it was more of the bonding with the tradition of hunting and the family. Now I see it more and more in the pride of property and growing and maintaining deer and habitat and even the non-targets. One of the coolest things we've been seeing on our property is a whole den of red fox. And it's just awesome to be able to see these animals going across the property, knowing that, we have a responsibility to maintain that place. And of course, it's the same thing when we see a great buck. To know that deer is utilizing our property and to figure out, how are we going to maintain them? I feel like half the time I'm thinking about more of protecting him and growing him, and then it's like, wait a minute, I'm trying to kill this deer.
Right.
So it's a fine line, but I think it's a really neat connection that more and more people, landowners or lessees, are doing with the property and with the deer.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. That's one of the most fulfilling aspects of having a property that you can consistently hunt or manage, or if you own it even, being able to, be a steward in some way and get to, see those deer and those animals and the wildlife flourish there. And then ultimately, have some opportunities to hunt and kill some animals too. But it's pretty cool looking at it holistically, and seeing everything that happens there and being able to be a positive influence on it is, that's pretty gratifying.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely the coolest part about it. And again, it's something that even if you don't succeed in the harvest, the fact that deer is a good chance he's going to live to see another day, or, maybe you get shot by a neighbor or someone else, and, you still have to kind of keep your head up and think about all the successes you had to get that deer to where it was. So I think that's probably the biggest aspect on owning or leasing property that people are taking pride in, and to me is a great success.
Yeah. Now I want to kind of, I want to look at your situation there in Pennsylvania on your new property. How do you plan on hunting that farm, or how are you thinking about going throughout the season? I'm kind of curious to see what your thought process is. Are you planning on? Do you already know where you want to hunt in the early season and the rut and everything? Have you figured that out yet, or are you going to observe and adjust, or what's the game plan?
It's a constant chess match, especially I think this first year. I see us doing a lot of scout/hunt at the same time, getting into a position, thinking that this is going to be the right spot, and then more than likely having to adjust based on observations over a couple hunts. I definitely have my places in mind that you kind of walk up to the first time, and you know that there's a good chance this is going to be something when the rut comes or even the early season. I think the hardest part about our property that we're going to be dealing with is how are these deer going to react when, 200,000 plus acres of hardwoods start raining down, acorns and beech nuts.
Yeah.
I've got them on my place, but it's no different than what's up above. In fact, there's probably more off my property than there is on the property. So I don't know if we're going to experience a little bit of a lull at that point. Or maybe, my place is thick enough that it's actually going to be the bedding area, and they're going to be going from that area up to these big mountaintops where a lot of the big oak flats are. If that's the case, now I got to figure out how am I going to hunt 20 plus acres of bedding area without knocking these deer around. So I think definitely the first year it's going to be a learning experience, one that will be exciting, but we'll probably be very cautious, if anything. There's a couple food plots, at least one that I want to put in off a log landing, just to establish something. It'll be an easy one to get to without disturbing too many of the deer. And I'm hoping my strategy for food plots, especially on a small farm, is always to draw them in the property. So I don't like putting food plots on the property lines. I don't like my deer leaving from the center of my property heading out. I want to pull them from my outside of the property in, especially in a hunting scenario. So that's something that I think this one will work out well with. But, I mean, it'll be a complete learning experience. I do think that there's a couple areas that'll be, kind of that standard tree stand spot that will likely lead to some sightings. The fact is, I don't know when. We may not see hardly any deer until, the end of November, December, when we start getting into these deer feeding on 70-80% natural browse. Or we could have them like right now, we've got bachelor groups moving through. I just don't know how far and where they're coming from. But I think that's probably the fun part about it is going to be learning these behaviors and strategies. There'll be more failures in the first year than there'll be successes, but
yeah,
that's just kind of how it goes.
That's the truth. Like you said, that's the fun part, figuring it out. So, So shifting now to the other type of hunting that I think I've seen you do in the past. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you have had a number of really good encounters recently hunting public land, and you've killed several good bucks. That's right, correct?
Yep, absolutely. I mean, I love hunting public land. It was kind of a forced passion, I guess, to start when I was in college and moving around and not having private land to hunt. So you kind of left with what you got, and I'm not going to stop hunting. So public land was the opportunity. And boy, it's a different challenge. It's a different beast. I know that it can be frustrating. I mean, there's been times in Mississippi hunting public land that I would go, I don't even know, 10, 20 hunts without even seeing a deer. So you talk about discouraging. Yeah, it's definitely the low of lows, but I think when you finally start to get on the deer, the successes are great. I mean, I've harvested my fair share of deer on public land and have had some encounters. I mean, I've killed deer that were Pope and Young and over on public land in Missouri. I've encountered deer that were, probably giving Boone and Crockett a run. And it's amazing to think that some of those deer are on there. I mean, I still think probably to this day, my best harvest on a public land was a doe in Missouri I killed with my muzzleloader 4 years ago. That we sent off to Matson's to have the Cemento Manuali tested, and it came back as an A+ rating for a 15-year-old deer.
Wow.
And you think about how did a 15-year-old doe survive that long on public land? And what did she see and what did she go through? And I think that was one of the challenges. But no, it's a whole different breed of hunting. I mean, talking about run and gun, I mean, bow season's obviously a lot different than gun season. there's some places that are great. I mean, Missouri, when I started, was one of those states that was unbelievable. And then we had EHD outbreaks, and it threw a curve in pretty much the rest of my hunting strategy for the entire time I lived there. But even in a state like Pennsylvania, where, we've got 800,000 deer hunters, I've seen a lot of bucks that are 3+ years old. It's just, you're not going to just go out, walk 100 yards from the vehicle and sit on a food plot. You're going to work for them. It's going to take some time, but they're there for sure. It just takes a lot of homework and a lot of effort. And, some people just don't want to do that. But for those that do, the opportunities exist.
So let's say for a hypothetical year, let's say you're going into this coming hunting season and you don't have this piece of private land that you now own, you don't have any leases, you have nothing. You're going to hunt public land. What does your process look like from finding a piece of public land to scouting it to actually hunting it? Walk me through a hypothetical year in that situation.
Well, it's kind of depends where I'm at. So I'll use Missouri where I was, for example. The first thing, usually, again, I go to a map, but the first thing I did is actually search out properties and what were the hunting methods allowed. Being a guy who hunts everything from bow to muzzleloader to gun, I mean, I'm a bow hunter by heart. I know that anywhere that offers the opportunity to hunt archery only or archery and muzzleloader likely has the chance of having older age class bucks than those that allow rifle hunting. Just simple math of pressure from local hunters during the hunting season. So I first went out and identified the areas that were bow hunting only or ones that offered bow and muzzleloader only. And typically those were the areas that I saw the best deer and had my best chances at deer. Again, it's a game of, I think the number one factor on public land is hunting pressure. You can avoid the hunting pressure or use it strategically to your advantage. The odds of success or at least encountering a good deer are much greater. I think as we get into the actual hunt itself, half of it's just luck, coming on it. But I think using the skills of scouting are never more tested. Finding scrapes and food sources and moving, always being mobile and adjusting during the season. I mean, I had spots that I knew when I put a stand in it, there was no way I was going to hunt it year round, that stand was probably going to end up in 5 different trees by the end of the season. And I think that's probably one of the most important things. And one of the things that most people don't do is, they'll get in a place that they've seen bucks in the past, and there's a good chance they'll run into them again. But, early season movements are a heck of a lot different than rut movements, a heck of a lot different than gun season, and then especially after gun season and what's left over. And I still think to this day, I've had more success hunting the late season, or at least more encounters hunting the late season on public land than I have any other time of the year. Just for the fact that I think deer are more predictable in their patterns. And there's a lot less hunters once gun season ends.
So are you finding then, I mean, it seems like once you get into that late season, these deer obviously have been pressured significantly over the course of the past couple months. Are you finding these deer in just the hardest to reach, hardest to find parts of a public land parcel then?
It depends on the timing. I mean, if it's directly after, a gun season, yeah, I mean, they're buried in there pretty good. And, but at that time of the year, deer's got to move, a deer's got to eat. So, they're going to be mobile. It's just finding them and accessing. As you get later into the year and the pressure is eased up for, a couple weeks, you start to see them moving back into their areas. Actually, what I think is early season. I mean, like summer patterns, to where they're getting back closer to food. They're not moving nearly as much, and it's very patternable in that they're going to be moving probably in the early morning and especially in the afternoon. And that's about it. So I think that you kind of use it to your advantage, in that if you knew where they were moving in their late summer, early fall patterns, by the time the season's ready to close, they're probably pretty darn close back onto those patterns.
Yeah. one of those, do any one of the bucks you've killed, recently in Missouri on public land, would any one of them be an interesting example to walk us through how that actually happened?
Yeah, I mean, we can, I guess, try to word that again for me. So
I'm just curious to hear about one of the specific bucks that you killed on public land, whether it be Missouri or one of the other places. I'd just be interested to hear about that specific situation, how you ended up sitting there,
Sure.
why you sat there, how it happened.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had a place, it was actually a city-owned property that was open. It was a bow hunting program. They were trying to reduce the number of deer within the city limits. And so it was an archery only. I had scouted it. It was only 250 acres, but it had some state park that was a border on it. So, there were certain areas that I figured deer were likely going to be in. And my instinct, again, thinking, not only is it bow hunting, but there's a state park that was not hunted at all. The potential for age structure was there. And so I had done one of my, and I still use it to this day, my biggest strategies is I try to identify the bedding area, or at least close to the bedding area right away. And then I start, working my way back in a funnel situation. And then as the season starts, I get increasingly aggressive, getting closer and closer and closer to that bedding area, pretty much to when it's rut, I'm in their wheelhouse. I'm in the bedroom at that point. And so for this particular deer, there were two other bucks that I was actually after ahead of this deer. There was a mature, I don't know, it was probably over mature, and it was 130, 140 inch deer. There was a what I called a giant 10, and at that point for public land, it was the biggest deer I'd ever seen. It was a 160 inch 12 point.
Wow.
And then the buck I ended up killing, which was just a solid 127 inch 8 point, but probably a 4-year-old deer. He had been getting more and more visible on trail camera. And so it was one of those deer that at 2 a.m. he was there pretty consistently. Then it was like 4 a.m. Then it was 5:30. And as we were getting to the rut, I knew in that area he was getting more and more consistent. So I set up in an area that was basically right off of his bedding area, where I thought his bedding area was. And just so happens it was one of those times where I had a hot doe come in, and it was probably getting towards the peak of the rut. And doe came in, bucks were chasing her, and it was a neat situation in that every time I rattled, I would draw in bucks, but if I grunted, I had no response whatsoever. And it almost made it difficult because I was in a cedar thicket, so I was getting bucks so close that, rattling, obviously I had more movement, and that's what I had to do to get them into bow range. The grunts just were ineffective. Snort wheezes were ineffective. And so this deer I let a huge rattling sequence out after seeing about 5 or 6 different bucks, all basically after in this area for this one doe. And just so happened to turn around behind me, and from the bedding area that I thought he was in, he came cruising through at about 10 a.m. And made a good shot on him. But I had seen that deer on camera since September, and this was in the middle of November. But it was one of those places that I hadn't seen but probably 7 deer in 20 hunts on the property. And most of them does and fawns. I had seen one shooter buck before then that I never got a shot at. But other than that, I hadn't even seen a buck in person. On camera at night, absolutely. So it was very reassuring that the fact of just knowing they're in the area, and again, that rut period, knowing that at any time it could happen and they could pop out right there, and that's pretty much what he did.
Yeah, trail cameras are definitely a great tool for just keeping the optimism alive. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Well, that's an awesome story. That sounds like a heck of a hunt. And killing a 4-year-old, nearly 130-inch 8-pointer on public land, that is awesome. So
it was awesome. It was the biggest deer I'd killed with anything to date, and at that time, and it was one of those ones that kind of, set me on fire again, I guess, especially thinking about all the time and putting the stand on public land.
Oh yeah, that's as good as it gets, I would think. So,
Yep.
Jeremy, we've been talking your ear off here for a pretty good time here, so we're gonna have to wrap it up. But I guess before we do that, this has been really interesting stuff. I know our listeners are going to want to hear more from you. So where can they go if they want to get more information from you, learn more about what you're doing, anything like that?
So we are still producing videos pretty frequently at thebuckadvisors.com. We always try to do something really cool, educational, informational. It's basically in real time. What people are going to be dealing with on their properties, whether that's a management thing or hunting strategies, or actually hunts from the field. And we get those out pretty regularly. I'd say we have between 1 and 3 a week, depending on the time of the season. So we do a lot on that. I still write a lot of articles for deer and deer hunting, and then also I've got basically a weekly or bi-weekly, depending on the seasonal timing, on outdoorchannel.com as well. Under it's a column called Everything Deer, and basically cover everything deer. Again, trying seasonality. My big thing is I want people to be reading and watching what they could be doing on their own property at that time. It's probably the best way to relate to what's going on out there in the deer woods at any given time. So those are basically the best ways, and at least on a deer standpoint, to get into me. But with Stone Road Media, we're at the ATA shows and at the SHOT shows, and we're doing expos. We're there with our Deer Grow product as well. So I always welcome guys to grab me and talk at any of the events, QDMA events, whatever they might have to talk deer. It's very rare that I'll ever turn down talking deer, that's for sure.
Well, I'm glad that's the case, because we were able to get you here to talk deer, and this was an interesting, fascinating conversation. I enjoyed it, and it probably was didn't think it was possible, but I'm even more stoked to get deer hunting now than I was about 2 hours ago. So thank you for that, man. Jeremy.
I appreciate it, Mark, anytime, and it was great to be on, and hopefully we can do it again sometime.
That sounds great. Good luck this season.
All right, thanks, buddy.
All right, well, before we wrap it up, a few quick reminders. First, be sure to check out the new 100% Wild podcast. Our latest episode featured former pro baseball player Jim Thome, and we discussed hunting from ground blinds and much more. So I think you guys will really enjoy that one. We also need to thank our partners who help make this podcast possible. So big thank you to Sitka Gear, Trophy Ridge, Bear Archery, Redneck Blinds, Huntera Maps, Ozonics, Carbon Express, Maven Optics, and the Whitetail Institute of North America. And finally, thank you all for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Jeremy as much as I did. And until next time, stay wired to hunt.
I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase.
Outdoor adventure won't wait for engine problems. Things like hard starts, rough performance, and lost fuel economy are often caused by fuel gum and varnish buildup. Seafoam can help your engine run better and last longer. You simply pour a can into your gas tank. Hunters and anglers rely on Seafoam to keep their engines running the way it should the entire season. So pick up a can of Seafoam today at your local auto parts store or visit seafoamworks.com to learn more.